Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to this third event in the Tax Justice Network's series 2022, An Urgent Year for Global Tax Action. Just to let you know, we have interpretation available to English, Spanish, and French. So to listen in your preferred language, please just click the interpretation button at the bottom of the screen, as you've now been doing for 2 years and know very well, and choose the language that you want to follow along in. So this webinar series, we've decided to produce this year instead of our normal annual conference. And the reason for that is that we want to really focus on these key advocacy moments, these key moments of opportunity for tax justice that we've seen. So the first event saw the launch of the Financial Secrecy Index 2022 that saw the United States move back to the top as the biggest global secrecy threat for the first time since, I think, 2009. And that's really given rise to, a kind of a growing focus on the fact that it's some of the most powerful economies and major financial centers, rather than some of the usual suspect small islands with palm trees that are really driving the financial secrecy that faces us around the world, and are also the major obstacle to things that some of those countries themselves want to do, like sanctioning Russian oligarchs, for example. So that conversation about secrecy that we've long known drives illicit financial flows and prevents stolen asset recovery and so on has now become one that the G7 too are thoroughly engaged in. So the second event in the series, we looked at the proposals for a global asset register to really cut through anonymous wealth for similar reasons, and which again has more momentum now than perhaps might have been expected a year ago because of those political movements. And there seems to be an opportunity for consensus from countries at different income levels in different regions with different concerns about ending anonymous wealth, finally, through that tool of a global asset register. Now, the final event of our series on the 28th of June, in 2 weeks' time, will look at proposals for a UN tax convention that's potentially a way to get that sort of inclusive international standard on transparency, but also to deliver on the corporate tax rules. And it's the corporate tax rules that we're talking about today. That's the focus of this event. The idea here is not that we'll rehash where the OECD proposals are exactly, though I'm about to do just a little bit of that, but that we'll ask our speakers to look at how the process has been, how the proposals are looking, and in effect, what is beyond the OECD proposals? Where do we go from here, given the evaluation of where things stand now? And so we're delighted to be joined by an extraordinarily high-level panel, people who have been engaged absolutely in the detail and in the politics of the OECD process in different ways and with different regions and country groups. I should say, first of all, that one of our speakers, Professor Atiya Waris, sadly has been taken ill and is unable at the last minute to join us. That's a great shame, but I'll say something about some of the work that Professor Waris has been doing as an independent expert on foreign debt and human rights at the United Nations in a moment. But our three speakers, the panel we have, are Mary Lou Wee, who is the director of the Secretariat of the G24 Intergovernmental Group of Countries, Abdul Chowdhury, who's a senior officer responsible for the South Centre's tax initiative at the Intergovernmental South Centre, and Dr. Nara Monkum, who until very recently was the Director of Research at the African Tax Administrators Forum, and is now about to take up a role as a professor at the University of Pretoria. So each of these speakers, as I say, has been directly involved in the OECD process and is also closely involved with a key group of countries from different regions and covering a range of income levels around the world. So they're expertly positioned to give us a sense of exactly how this process has gone so far and how they evaluate the proposals as they stand and what might be coming next. Okay, before we go to the panel, I will talk a bit about where we've been in this process, potentially saying things that some of our panelists disagree with, so that might set up some conversations later. I should say at the end of the three presentations, we'll go into a Q&A session, and I'll remind later, but there is again a Q&A button at the bottom of your screens to start framing questions as you hear from our panelists. So look, I guess it's a moment perhaps to look back, at least to some extent, on the OECD process. But when I say the OECD process, I don't really mean just the last few years, though we should focus there, but perhaps the longer sweep of time. Speaking at the EU Tax Observatory yesterday on a panel with Pascal Saint-Amand from the OECD, I realized that for perhaps a lot of people involved in the process now, there isn't necessarily the same sense of quite the history behind corporate tax reforms. Not least, going back to the decisions of the League of Nations, the then group of imperial powers in the 1920s and the 1930s, that really set in place the arm's length principle upon which our current tax rules are based. Worth reminding ourselves, I think, that those decisions, rightly or wrongly, were taken in a very different context, where the multinational companies in question were primarily companies based in the imperial power, in the metropolis, and acting in one or two colonies, typically in some kind of extractive process for raw materials that would then be sold on elsewhere. That world has clearly changed, both the power dynamics behind empire, but also the nature of multinational companies. The alternative that the League of Nations eventually dismissed was unitary taxation, taxing multinationals not as if the different entities within them traded at arm's length, and therefore you could work out where the profit should be as long as those internal prices were correct, but taxing at the unit of the multinational group itself. So assessing the global profits, where the profits are actually maximized, and then apportioning them as tax base between the different countries and jurisdictions where the real economic activity takes place. So where the sales and the employment perhaps actually is. Now, if we roll forward to the 1990s, we find that system breaking down. But let's stop for a moment in the 1960s on the way. So after the United Nations was set up, in theory as the successor to the League of Nations after the Second World War, there was a deliberate attempt to be more inclusive of countries, not only the imperial powers, and that brought about a different type of somewhat democratic, at least, interactions within the United Nations. And an important early dynamic was the group of lower income countries, largely former colonies, seeking to use the United Nations to, in some sense, discipline the actions of multinational companies where they were most extractive or abusive within their countries. That was, of course, as you can imagine, resisted fairly strongly by those imperial powers. And in the 1960s, they established the OECD and very quickly gave it the power to host tax discussions and negotiations rather than letting that happen in the United Nations. And things continued on that basis through to the 1990s, when, as Aimé Césaire famously talked about the Boomerang of Empire, this idea that what you allowed to happen in the colonies wouldn't affect you in the metropolis was proven to be, once again, to be untrue. In effect, the behaviors of multinational companies that had been tolerated by rich countries, as long as it was only taking place in lower income countries, came back to haunt those rich countries. So in the 1990s, US-based multinationals were shifting about 5% of their profits globally away from the location of their real economic activity. That's the early 90s. By the late 1990s, it had already expanded to about 10% of their global profits. And by the early 2010s, it was as much as 25 to 30% and continuing to rise sharply. And it's at that point, after the financial crisis, that had put enormous fiscal pressure on those high-income countries and really made tax and tax justice a much more high-profile political issue for their publics, that there was this move finally to consider radical reforms to the international tax rules. And so before the first BEPS process, base erosion and profit shifting, began in 2013, the initial outline document included the possibility of going beyond the arm's length principle and looking at unitary tax alternatives, but that was struck out before the work began seriously in 2013, because ultimately the main OECD countries, particularly the United States, weren't comfortable with that. And we and a great many others at that stage predicted that the BEPS process would, in a sense, be unable to deliver on the one goal that the G20 had given it, which was to better align taxable profits with the location of real activity. Because the failure of alignment, or the degree of profit misalignment, is a direct result of exploitation of the arm's length principle. The decision to leave the principle in place in 2013 pretty much left the OECD try their hardest, though they might, putting little bits of patch here and there on a system that needed fundamental reform. And so it was no surprise, really, that in 2016, almost as soon as the BEPS process had finished, the United States brought forward completely inconsistent major reforms under President Trump, including a version of a minimum tax. And the European Union returned to looking at its proposal for a common consolidated corporate tax base, which is, of course, a unitary tax measure for the EU. And again, no surprise that this fairly quickly brought everyone back to the table in BEPS 2.0, if you like, which began in 2019, which you'll agree seems a very, very long time ago now. And certainly for anyone who's been involved in those negotiations, and we'll hear from them very soon, what was supposed to be a 2-year process to go beyond the arm's length principle, to introduce forms of unitary taxation, and to create a minimum tax. So these two key elements: one, to make profit shifting much harder, because unitary tax requires alignment of profits with the location of real activity, and two, to make profit shifting much less attractive by having an effective minimum tax rate everywhere, and therefore ending the race to the bottom. It was perhaps optimistic to think that could be done in 2 years, but it began with the inclusive framework. For the first time, a much bigger group than OECD countries, including 50 or so lower income countries and a set of dependent territories also, able, in theory, to have an equal voice in decision making. But fairly quickly, it became clear that wasn't quite how it was going to work, and that's one thing we'll discuss today. So the inclusive framework agreed a work plan for Pillar 1, looking at alternatives or going beyond the arm's length principle, that included 3 different options for the OECD Secretariat to assess and come back with an evaluation about the potential revenue impacts and so on. One of those 3 options was the G24 proposal for effectively a form of apportionment. Just a second, there's a fire alarm here. I'll just mute for a moment and hope it stops. Okay, this is not a drill. I'm going to have to evacuate. I will ask, if I can, our first speaker, to begin, which is Mary Lou Wee from the G24. Mary Lou, if you're able to make your presentation, I will hope to be back from this fire alarm by the time you finish. My apologies.
It's okay, Alex. Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to join this event today, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, wherever you are. It really is a pleasure to be part of this panel. Now, today I've been asked to speak on the views of the G24 on the global tax deal and possible opportunities to strengthen the voice of developing countries in shaping global tax initiatives. Financing for development is particularly high in the agenda of the G24, whose principals are finance ministers and central bank governors. An international tax cooperation is needed to reverse the disproportionate revenue losses that developing countries have experienced historically due to the flaws of the longstanding global tax regime. Now, to structure my remarks, I will first discuss key elements of the G24's messages and views on the current proposals, and then move on to some actions that policymakers and inclusive framework itself could take to further promote inclusive governance. Now, on the key elements of the G24 advocacy and its expectations of the current global tax regime. Developing countries broadly supported the global effort to develop a multilateral solution to address the taxation challenges arising from digitalisation. In its collective views, shared with the inclusive framework, as far back as 2019, early on in the process, the G24 strongly advocated for changing the tax nexus to move beyond physical presence to recognizing substantial economic presence. This should also be coupled with a flexible approach to attribute profits using a formula or a fractional apportionment method that would then divide up profits, global profits of multinationals to jurisdictions. And on top of this, introduce a withholding tax mechanism. This represented a simple solution, especially keeping in mind the resource and capacity level of developing countries. A key concern of our group at that time is the importance of achieving a satisfactory and sustainable outcome that will work for the broad membership of the inclusive framework. Now, fast forward to now. At this point, the resulting global tax deal instills positive reform directions by introducing a global minimum tax and a formulaic apportionment of part of the profits, a very limited part of the global profits of multinationals to market countries. Unfortunately, most developing countries expect to gain little in terms of revenues from both pillars 1 and 2 as currently designed. Much has been said on why that is so, and I believe other speakers will speak on this. So I'll focus on what developing countries can do to improve their revenue prospects. On Pillar 1, there are now emerging estimates that many developing countries will receive small revenue gains, and some may even lose revenues from the pillar. In moving forward, policymakers will therefore need to weigh these revenues or loss of revenues against the cost of implementing the new rules, the impact on taxes, on tax uncertainty or tax certainty, and the opportunity cost of losing the right to implement unilateral measures should the pillar fail to generate revenues, sufficient revenues. For Pillar 2, there is scope for developing countries to strengthen taxation at source, covering not only digital activities, but also other areas with important revenue potential for developing countries. There's quite a bit of scope to doing this. Experience so far shows that developing countries, especially those with low tax administration capacity, have been able to increase domestic revenues by setting domestic minimum corporate tax floors even outside of Pillar 1. These can be investigated or explored by countries who still have not set these floors. They can also reform investment tax incentives, which may no longer be valuable when home countries implement the global minimum tax. So let me now turn to my last point, or my second point, on addressing the challenges to effective participation by developing countries in global tax governance. In playing its role in the governance of global taxation, the G20 OECD also expanded the participation to developing countries. This was carried out through the Global Forum for Tax Transparency and Exchange of Information, and then subsequently the Inclusive Framework to implement BEPS, which now has 141 members, of which nearly 2/3 are non-OECD countries. Now, developing countries have valued the increased awareness brought about in the forum of harmful tax practices and actions to mitigate them. And these forums fostered changes that developing countries have appreciated, especially in terms of raising awareness. But they also expressed the sentiment that the views of developing countries, particularly in enhancing their revenues, can be better considered. Going forward, and given the expectation that the continued role of the inclusive framework, in particular in implementing the global tax deal and even further global tax reforms, a key question is how to build on its progress so far to further enhance inclusion in the years ahead and improve the voice of developing countries. To address this question, let me speak on the roles of capacity building in enhancing participation, but also on possible ways forward to improve inclusion in the processes of the inclusive framework. On participation and building capacity. In deliberations within the inclusive framework, a few large developing countries have emerged as active participants and as vocal and respected experts. Nevertheless, a 2021 survey of the International Center for Tax and Development in the University of Sussex documented the relatively silent presence of most developing countries in the technical and political workings of the inclusive framework. Similarly, the 2021 OECD report recognizes the challenges of achieving more effective participation and, to quote, full integration into the new architecture by lower capacity countries. To address this, the OECD is taking steps to help countries build capacity to facilitate participation in meetings. It will also support peer learning platforms at the regional level, such as what had been achieved in ATAF, to facilitate knowledge sharing and develop shared and collective views. These are positive steps, useful steps. Developing countries, however, themselves will also have to lead in developing their capacities to participate and finding forums, developing forums to form and reinforce collective views. Beyond capacity building, improvements in the inclusive framework's governance arrangements to better reflect the broad membership will still be needed. As part of this effort, a co-chair of the inclusive framework steering group from a non-OECD country has been recently appointed. More actions could still possibly be explored in the framework's governance processes to ensure more equitable representation using some metrics. For example, one proposal to support the work of one proposal could be further explored would be the creation of an independent secretariat to support the work of the inclusive framework. This could possibly learn from the experience of the secretariat to the global forum. This step would enable leadership from a non-OECD country and greater staff diversity that reflects the inclusive framework's broad and diverse membership. Yet one other governance consideration, of course, as Alex said, is to promote broader-based political engagement beyond the G20 and the OECD. Here, perhaps, there is scope to explore opportunities to strengthen the role of the UN, and I believe other speakers will speak to this in the next session or in the next event, which has a further and the UN has a further has a broader membership, but also more extensive consultation processes. So let me stop here. I hope Alex is back.
Yes, I am just. Thank you, Mary Lou, and sorry about that. I'll just hand straight over to Abdul as the next speaker, with a view to coming back with questions after. So, Abdul, one thing that you've been doing at the South Centre is, of course, working on revenue estimates because of the lack of available information on what the proposals could actually mean. So I think that will make up part of your presentation. We're certainly very much looking forward to seeing how that looks. So over to you, please.
Thank you, Alex. And good to see that you're safe and sound, and really kudos to your commitment. And I would like to begin by thanking the Tax Justice Network for the invitation and to appreciate them for their work, which is really ahead of time. I mean, they were ahead of time on the country by country reporting proposal. They were ahead of time on this idea of unitary taxation, which is now becoming an international standard. And I'm sure they'll continue to be very, very forceful in advocating for reforms for all countries, but especially the developing countries. So as Alex said, revenue estimates on this pillar one is something which I'll look at. So let me start my presentation. So I hope everyone can see my screen, and please let me know if they can't. So I'll actually begin by a slightly different tack by talking about the United Nations and its solution, because all too often this discussion is kind of revolving around the OECD. So I'll start with a few words about the UN Tax Committee, which really is the premier international tax body of the world. It's a subsidiary body of ECOSOC. It has 25 members, 13 of which are from the developing countries and 12 of them are from the developed countries. The members act as experts in their independent capacity, and it sets international tax standards for the world. Now, why I'm beginning with the UN Tax Committee is to talk about the solution for the taxation of the digitalized economy, which the UN Tax Committee has produced, which is something which we don't talk about enough. So this is Article 12B, and I'll get to what that means. But the first thing to note is that the solution for this critical problem, which the OECD has been discussing for more than a decade, has been provided very quickly. It was provided in 1 year, which is pretty amazing when you think about how long the OECD process has gone on. It started in April 2020, and a year later it was finished. The solution was ready. It was also provided in a very timely manner during COVID, when countries really needed a solution so that they could begin bringing in the money. This was also provided in a completely developing country-led manner. So the Article 12B was drafted by a drafting group, which consisted entirely of developing country members of the UN Tax Committee. And there was severe opposition from the developed countries, the developed country members, and this was overcome through voting. And as I will come back to through my presentation, voting is something which is really very important to the system of international tax rulemaking, because this is a zero-sum game. One country gives up the taxing right to another country, so opposition is something which cannot be escaped. The solution is also quite simple to implement, because again, it was prepared by developing countries. It is something which protects state sovereignty, because it's basically an update to a model tax convention of the United Nations. And it builds on the existing decentralized international tax system, which is basically built on bilateral tax treaties. So it's something which countries are already used to, especially developing countries. Now, what exactly is Article 12B? So it's an article of the UN Model Tax Convention for taxing income from automated digital services. So this would mean income from online advertisement, search engines like Google, intermediation platforms like Amazon, and so on. It provides two solutions: a gross method, and this is basically a digital service tax with the benefits of a tax treaty, and a net method. So the net method basically takes the global or the segmental profit rate of the company, applies that to the local revenues, which are a very simple formula to determine the net profits on which the domestic corporate income tax rate is applied. And I must say that this net method is basically what Marilu had referred to earlier, the original G24 proposal on fractional apportionment, which was removed from the OECD. So it was brought into the UN Model Tax Convention. Taxpayers can choose which method they want to apply, and this is the essence of what Article 12B is about. But the United Nations has provided other solutions to developing countries as well, as it continues to do so. The latest update of the UN Model Tax Convention provides a solution for taxing payments for computer software as royalties, very, very important for developing countries. A means to address the issue of offshore indirect transfers, where mergers and acquisitions happen through tax havens to escape capital gains taxes. It has expanded definitions of permanent establishment, again, very important to decide who is paying the tax. new expansions of the idea of beneficial ownership, which Alex, of course, talks about and his organization campaign about quite a bit. Expansion to collective investment vehicles, which are basically pension funds, real estate investment trusts, and so on. So the takeaway from this is really that the United Nations continues to deliver international tax solutions for all countries in a timely, efficient, accountable, transparent, and democratic manner. And each of these terms is very, very important. But this is unfortunately not really true for the OECD process, because if we just look at the outputs, if we begin with the OECD model convention, this allocates income to the developed countries by giving priority to the residence countries, which are capital exporting countries, which are developed countries. The same is true for the transfer pricing guidelines. These allocate or attribute profits through the so-called functions, assets, and risk approach. Practically what this does is that it attributes profits to the producing countries, which are industrialized countries and developed countries. The same is true for the base erosion and profit shifting standards, the BEPS standards. These again were devised first of all solely by the developed countries, and not because they suddenly became concerned about tax avoidance, but because they themselves were affected by tax avoidance in the 2008 crisis. And similarly for the inclusive framework, I mean, this was created after half century of the OECD's existence. And it's not that they suddenly realized that they were not being inclusive. This was created in response to the pressure for a UN tax body in the Addis Ababa 2015 Financing for Development discussions. Now coming to the inclusive framework. First of all, it has no statutory basis. There's no underlying treaty, there's no underlying legal agreement. So it has no statutory basis. There is no rules of procedure. For international organizations, there are rules of procedure which determine how things work, how decisions are taken, how meetings take place, and so on. It has none of that. There is no transparency. I mean, nobody knows what goes on in these discussions. There is no democracy because it functions on the consensus principle. So they cannot be, I mean, it's again, this is unclear because there are no rules of procedure, but there is, to known knowledge, there is no voting and there is no public records of the meeting. So nobody can really find out what happens in there. And the accountability is limited only to the rich and powerful countries of the G20 and the OECD. So now let's look at the solution for the taxation of the digital economy, which has come out of this institution, the inclusive framework. So they've provided pillar 1, amount A. Amount A is the OECD solution for taxation of the digital economy. In December last year, the Coalition for Dialogue on Africa, which is a special initiative of the African Union, and the South Center partnered and commissioned a study for revenue estimates for Article 12B versus amount A for the member states of the South Center and the African Union. So we now have the study. It's a preliminary study because these are the first ever revenue estimates of Article 12B and the first ever country level estimate for amount A, especially at this scale. So the study, the link is over here, covers 84 countries, which is the joint membership of the African Union and the South Center. It must be said these are conservative estimates because as the rules which will detail how amount A is implemented are being released, it's being shown that this is, it is going to be less because they are further constricting the scope. The revenues from Article 12B are likely going to be even more because the study uses a 750 million threshold, whereas Article 12B doesn't have any revenue threshold. So our study will, so the study basically covers which are the countries who will redistribute amount A, because this is basically some countries have to agree to give up the taxing right to others. So who are these countries? How many companies will come under the scope of Article 12B with a 750 million threshold? But more importantly, where are these companies headquartered? And revenue estimates for the global South regions of Africa, Asia, and the Latin America and the Caribbean. We'll also look at the G20 countries that are members of the South Center and the African Union, and the 4 countries that said no to the 2-pillar solution. So when we look at the countries which will redistribute amount A, out of 76 countries which will be in scope, if the sales threshold is set at 20 billion, we see that 37 or nearly half of these companies come from the United States. The other important countries are Japan, UK, China, Switzerland, France. So the ratification of these countries is really important to the functioning of amount A, because unless they agree to redistribute profits, nobody's getting any profits. So our first recommendation to developing countries is to wait until all of these countries, especially the US, have ratified Pillar 1 before even thinking about signing. Now coming to Article 12B, how many companies are in scope? If we take a narrow approach and include only so-called pure automated digital service companies like online advertising and so on, we see there are a total of 84 companies with a 750 million threshold. But again, Article 12B has no threshold. This was applied just to keep the number of companies manageable. And if the number of companies is broadened to include hybrid companies, which includes finance, telecom, and so on, then that increases to 305 companies. So looking at where these companies are based, again, half of them are in the US, and Canada, China, Japan, UK, France are other important countries. So these really are the countries which developing countries will have to consider either signing tax treaties or renegotiating tax treaties if they want to implement Article 12B.
Abdul, can I just ask you to slow down slightly for the interpreters, please? This is great, but just a little slow. Thank you.
Yes, I'll do that. So our second recommendation to developing countries is that Article 12B is better with a broad scope, with including hybrid ADS companies, because that will really make a difference to the money that comes into the pocket, as we'll see. So here are the results. So if we look at the revenue estimates of Amount A versus Article 12B for the member states of the South Center, we see that in 2020, orange is basically the revenue from Pillar 1, and the rest is from the UN, from Article 12B. So this is the gross method with a 3% rate. This is the gross method with a 4% rate, and this is the net method. So we see that in 2020, with a 20 billion threshold for Amount A, South Center member states, which are 54 countries, are getting 4.9 billion. And if the threshold is reduced to 10 billion, they're getting 5.5 billion. And if we look at Article 12B's gross method with a 3% rate, with a narrow scope, only pure ADS companies, they're getting 3 billion. And if the scope is broadened to include hybrid companies, they're getting 8.6 billion. And with a 4% rate, it is 4 billion with a narrow scope and 11.4 billion with a broad scope. And for the net method, it's 2 billion with a narrow scope and 4.2 billion with a broad scope. So the real comparison, which we'll do for the rest of the revenue estimates, is to look at this figure, the revenues from the 20 billion threshold, and compare it with these two, because Article 12B has a broad scope, basically. So the comparison here, from a revenue perspective, it's clear that the best option is Article 12B gross method with a 4% rate, which will give them almost 3 times what they would get from Amount A, 11.4 billion. When we look at the African Union's member states, which again are 54 countries, we see that from the OECD solution, they're getting 0.5 billion, and they're getting almost 3 times from the UN solution with 1.4 billion. And this is true for most of the revenue estimates. Coming to the Nigeria, which is one of the countries that said no, again, we can see very clearly that they're benefiting much more from the UN solution with 371 million. Going to Kenya, it's the same. They're getting almost 3 times, 25.5 million from the OECD solution and 74.8 from the UN solution. Kenya also said no. Coming to South Africa, which is a G20 country, they seem to benefit from the OECD solution. In fact, they're getting negative revenues from the UN solution. And the explanation for this is that South Africa is home to many multinational enterprises. So they would lose the tax base either way, and hence benefiting from Amount A. Coming to East and Southeast Asia, excluding China and Indonesia, we again see that the best option from a revenue perspective is the UN solution with a 4% rate. Coming to China, we see that there is some variation because it's a capital exporting country. But even then, they're getting almost twice from the UN solution versus the OECD solution. With Indonesia, there's a very big gap. And again, the UN solution is the best option. Indonesia is also currently the G20 chair. Coming from Malaysia, which is another G20 country, they're getting 82.9 from the OECD solution and almost twice from the UN solution, 189.2 million. Coming to India, they are again getting almost thrice from the UN solution, 1 billion, and 1/3 from the OECD solution, 0.27 billion. Sri Lanka, which is one of the countries that said no, the pattern holds true, 29.5 from the OECD solution, 104.5 from the UN solution. Pakistan, which also said no, 49.3 from the OECD solution, and significantly more, almost 4 times from the UN solution, 182.5. The same pattern is true for Latin America and the Caribbean. They're getting the most from the UN solution with a 4% rate. For Brazil, in fact, they're getting no additional taxes. If the threshold is lowered, they're getting 0.5 in any case from the OECD solution, and more than thrice from the UN solution, 1.7 billion. And the same is true for Argentina, 95.7 from the OECD solution, 347.1 from the UN solution. Now, coming to the conclusion, we see that most countries are getting 3 to 4 times from the Article 12B gross method with a 4% rate compared to Amount A. OECD solution is really of minimal benefit to developing countries. Developing countries should wait in any case until US, UK, Japan, France, Germany, Switzerland, Ireland ratify, not just sign, but they ratify Pillar 1. Developing countries who don't have a tax treaty with countries where companies in scope of Article B or Amount A are headquartered have an advantage. They can and should introduce digital service taxes or other unilateral measures consistent with Article 12B. If the headquarter country wants to avoid double taxation, Article 12B provides a fair treaty-based solution. Developing countries are trying to multilateralize Article 12B through the UN Tax Committee, and I'm happy to speak more about that if there are questions. Pressure is likely on developing countries who refuse Pillar 1. The Sri Lankan ambassador to the World Trade Organization recently called for South-South solidarity to prevent arm twisting. Now going forward, a UN Framework Convention on Tax Cooperation. So we have seen there's an urgent need for a global tax body that is first of all accountable to all countries, not just the rich and powerful countries, which is democratic, where decisions are made by voting. And again, these are zero-sum games. One country's gain is another's loss. So confrontation is inevitable. Voting is absolutely essential to have solutions which are actually workable and which are transparent, where the meetings are public and there is a record of deliberations. And the OECD is unlikely to ever meet this standard because Article 1 of the OECD Convention mandates it to prioritize its members' interests. And Article 6 mandates consensus-based decision-making. In theory, decisions can be voted upon, but the decision to put something to vote itself requires a consensus decision. So it's virtually impossible. And I encourage you to read the OECD Convention's articles to see this for yourself. So one way forward is through a United Nations Framework Convention on Tax Cooperation. So some of the key features, this could basically, first of all, it builds on recommendations by the FACTI panel, and the group of 77 has for a long time wanted a UN tax body. So this is one contribution to this discussion. So this would basically consist of a conference of parties with universal membership like you have in the UNFCCC. And there would be specialized technical bodies which look at specific issues. It would incorporate and streamline existing international tax agreements. Like, for example, you have the MCMAA, which looks at exchange of information. You have the multilateral instrument and so on. It would also could also create new instruments as necessary. And most importantly, it would bring existing international tax institutions like the Inclusive Framework, the UN Tax Committee, and so on, under supervision of the Conference of Parties. This is very important because then these institutions would report to all countries instead of just the rich and powerful countries. So there would be unified, universal, democratic international tax governance. And this would mean that the standards are much more likely to be adopted by everybody instead of having this complex system which we have right now. Additional details can be seen in this policy brief, which was prepared by Saul Picciotto and myself, and the link is over here. And with that, I hope I've not taken too much time, and I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Abdul. It's very comprehensive and making me glad that I didn't actually finish my remarks because between you and Mary Lou, I think you've said anything I might have added much better. But I want to pass to Nara Monkham for a third perspective on this. Nara, having been involved throughout with the African Tax Administrators Forum, has been closely engaged, including in the negotiations. So perhaps I don't know, is it a similar perspective or perhaps differing in important ways? Nara, over to you.
Similar somewhat. But thank you very much. First, I'd like to greet everybody this afternoon here in South Africa, but hello to everyone. And thank you very much to TDN for inviting me to be part of this very important event. So basically my task was to present a perspective on how the inclusive framework and the agreement have felt for non-OECD members. So the gist of my presentation is that basically, although we will present the fact that although some gains have been made with the work that has been done, there still remains a lot of work to be done to ensure that we have an equitable allocation of taxing right for African countries and developing countries in general. So we all know, for example, that that international tax governance is necessary to ensure that we have a consistent adoption and interpretation and implementation of international standards that is required to actually mitigate the global effect of IFF and build tax entity at the global level. And then the critical role of developing countries that that developing countries need to play in this international tax governance process has been recognized. For example, again, has been said last year in July, the OECD recognized that, announced that out of 139 countries, 130 countries have basically joined the new two-pillar plan to reform international tax rules at the global level. So this is an important milestone, of course, because global consensus on tax challenges, especially arising from digitalization of the economy, is critical, especially for developing countries to assist in rebuilding the economies after the post-COVID-19 environment, pandemic. Corporate tax, income tax in particular, represent a very high share of tax revenue and GDP in developing countries compared to the rich countries. And for example, tax levies on companies are higher in most African countries, with on average 16% of total tax revenue, compared to 9% in OECD countries. So African countries have been trying to enhance a tax yield for corporate from corporation by introducing new measures, such as measures to stop the aggressive transfer pricing schemes by MNEs, measures to strengthen mining regimes, and of course new policies on tax incentives. So. But the digitalization of economies have created new challenges, as we know, because many African countries and developing countries have not been able to actually tax highly digitalized business. So therefore, this development of global rules, tax rule, is a key part of tax policy consideration for these countries, especially in the post-COVID era. So obtaining an inclusive framework agreement on effective and equitable Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 rules is therefore of critical importance of African countries. And like I said, although some inroads have been made, there's still much work to be done to ensure that a more equitable tax allocation is actually implemented to stem illicit financial flow from Africa. And many African governments are concerned that this plan for taxing the digital economy may not go as far enough to address actually the problem that they actually face. So I will go quickly because Abdul mentioned some of these issues. For example, in terms of Pillar 1, African countries under the leadership of ATAF and the African Union have proposed that the reallocation of profit should be calculate as a portion of the MNE's total profit instead of residual profit. The inclusive framework have decided not to adopt this approach. They have agreed to allocate between 20 and 30% of residual profit to the market jurisdictions. But in the opinions of African countries, we need to at least to have at least 35% of residual profit to be allocated to those market jurisdictions. And especially because this leads to low level of profit allocation, especially to smaller market jurisdictions. Again, ATAF in partnership with the African Union continue to call upon the inclusive framework to undertake further work on this tax allocation issue. And just a side note on that, a recent study have been produced on Chile, and they actually found that the reform based on the standard OECD guidelines was ineffective in reducing multinationals' transfer to low tax countries, and did not actually significantly raise tax payment. And again, it's a little bit in line with what Abdul was presenting earlier. But at the same time, interestingly, interviews with tax advisors in Chile actually revealed that a drastic increase in tax advisory services, meaning that these results illustrate that when the enforcement can be circumvented by sophisticated tax planning, it can actually benefit the tax consultants at the expense of tax authority and taxpayers. I thought that was an interesting actual research that have been published recently in the Chile case. In terms of Pillar 2, again, African countries, again, under the leadership of ATAF, has welcomed the introduction of a global minimum tax rate, of course. But whereas the inclusive frameworks had agreed that the minimum tax rate will be at 15%, African countries, again, led by ATAF and the African Union, has specifically stated that the minimum effective tax rate should be at least 20%. To be effective in protecting the African tax base and stemming artificial profit shifting out of Africa. So again, the work continued there, must continue in that sense to make sure that at least the rate must be increased there. Thirdly, developing countries also should not exert political pressure on developing countries. Because again, those are the things that we saw on the ground, at least when I was still working with ATAF, especially for countries that are not member of the inclusive framework or the inclusive framework members that have chosen not to adopt the new rules as presented by Abdul earlier. Political pressure should not be brought on these countries. It is very important that countries join the inclusive framework because they want to join, and not because they have been coerced into doing so. Right now, for example, out of the 24 members, African countries member of the inclusive framework, we know that 4 countries, Angola, DRC, Congo, Kenya, and Nigeria, have not decided to join the new 2-pillar plan to reform international tax rules. So other consideration must include first the fact that these issues that are debated at the inclusive framework are highly complex, they're highly controversial and expert resource intensive. And the question that we must ask, and that we've been asking since the beginning, is that the country have actually the capacity not only to understand, but also to efficiently influence the rules to fit the preferences, their preferences and economic reality. That's one question. And another aspect to consider is that the number of meetings at the inclusive framework is quite substantial. Countries are, of course, not always able to attend, even virtually. And some African countries don't have the resources nor the capacity or the expertise to actually attend them. So when the country received, for example, a document after 10 p.m., after work in the meetings in the evening with the response deadline for the next morning, how can that country effectively actually protect its taxing right with such a deadline? And that's a real things that there's really instances of something that happened to countries, at least African countries. So if we are not careful about the pace of this process, the number of meetings, the deadlines, and the short notice to comment, it can actually lead to a de facto exclusion of African countries or developing countries in general. And so this is something that we have to be extremely careful of. We have to continue to raise caution about elements of the process that may lead to implicit de facto exclusion, because definitely we've seen on the ground that it can happen. Also, the first presenter mentioned it, countries will require support in the technical design of the 2-pillar agreement in the implementation. Because of course they will face enormous challenges in implementing these new rules within the very ambitious timeline, which is the end of 2023. So to that effect, I just wanted to raise again, based on what was said earlier in the presentation, that technical capacity building offered to African countries or developing countries in general is not a panacea. So saying that they have access to technical capacity building and that's it, so therefore everything is good, that's not the solution. Countries will require real support in implementing the details of the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 in form of, for example, experts on the ground. So that's very critical. And of course, another challenge is to make sure that more developing countries actually speak in these meetings. And we've seen that this agreement can actually lead to valuable and beneficial changes. So, so it's vital that, again, developing countries continue to ensure that the inclusive framework agreement is not the end of the global tax debate. And we need to continue to press for greater and more fundamental change to be addressed, not only to ensure that there's a fair and equitable allocation of taxing right, but also that IFF out of Africa or developing countries in general through artificial profit shifting actually is curbed. Right. So in terms of the solution, again, Abdullah said it earlier, we have to ensure that extensive regional consultation in Africa and developing countries actually continue, because that's where the solutions solutions are designed that are fit for purpose, actually, for this country. So we need to continue to have this extensive regional consultation, and the role of African Union, at least in the African continent, in that sense, is key. And again, we need then bringing those decisions, bringing these solutions again to the international arena, again through a process that actually respects the governance and the governance and the needs of all international all countries. And the United Nations Tax Committee can definitely be a suitable platform for that. So that's what I wanted to share in terms of contribution to this panel. Thank you so very much for your attention.
Thank you, Nora. A fascinating and in some ways slightly dismal reflection on, the extent to which countries were or were not meaningfully included. I think we've heard there three, sets of perspectives with a huge amount in common. I'm afraid I missed too much of Mary Lou's, but I hope that's true to say. What I'd like to do is, well, two things. So I want to encourage everyone who's with us to put questions in the Q&A if you have them, and I'll start to pick up from there. But we have a bit more than half an hour, so we have time, and I'd like to pick through a set of questions just to try and draw out some key points from the different contributions we've had there. In particular, I suppose I have some ideas that I want to test, and you can tell me these are unfair or not. So to begin, a set of questions around lower income countries and sort of the perhaps a characterization that I want to test. What we know from our research in the state of tax justice, from what we've heard today, from the different evaluations that people have done, including Unctad's evaluation most recently, the work of the EU Tax Observatory and others, are kind of a set of, well, not stylized facts, a set of facts that include the following: that lower income countries lose the largest share of their current tax revenues to corporate tax abuse, that lower income countries have least voice in the international rule setting, that lower income countries have least access to country by country reporting in particular that would allow them to evaluate the OECD proposals, and least or no public access to OECD evaluations, and that lower income countries are likely to gain the least or perhaps lose the most from these proposals. So I'd like to ask each of you if that's an unfair characterization on any point, and if it's fair, what do we do from here? What can lower income countries do if that's the situation that they face, including within the OECD process, which has been the most inclusive compared to any other OECD process? If it's still looking like that, looking as bad as that, what's the answer? And I suppose in particular, I'm kind of interested to know whether you think we can fix the OECD and make it genuinely inclusive, turn that dynamic upside down, or we need to look elsewhere. But Mary Lou, can I come to you first on that? And apologies if you actually gave a direct answer to that in your presentation when I was having a fire alarm.
Well, let me just, is it a fair characterization? But let me start by saying that it is an actual, it's a reality. The numbers bear them out in terms of revenue losses historically, and estimates, which I think are founded on good, fairly good information base, show that the losses, that the gains are least with a new arrangement. So it's fair. Is it fair? Well, of course not. But the issue is how to get the views of developing countries more squarely on the table. When proposals are being proposed, and that squarely on the table means heard and considered. So, and part of it perhaps is, as Abdul mentioned, that the OECD, the OECD members, of course, are the more powerful countries that, and bargaining power do play a big role in how proposals are done. Now, that said, developing countries would need to, there are possibilities for developing countries to have their views heard on the table, but the problem, of course, is capacity. And that was definitely pointed out by most of our members as a real issue, in the sense that in a consensus building, in a forum where consensus building and no objections and actual voice matter, that the silence of many developing countries may actually be misconstrued as agreement. So there could be ways to address that by bringing their concerns on the table much more explicitly, even though at the plenary itself, they may not necessarily raise their hands. So these are all very practical considerations, as we expect that the inclusive framework will be there for some time to come. So those are my comments.
Thanks. Let me pass the same question, Abdul, to you. Whether that's accurate, and if it is, what the options are now.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. And as Mary Lou said, which I fully agree with, these are the facts. I mean, to just give some data, a country like Chad loses 17% of its GDP to illicit financial flows. I mean, can you imagine? So the data is very, very clear that these are disproportionately affecting countries which have already been historically colonized and are the poorest countries in the world. And it's, you had also mentioned about exchange of information. I think only 4 countries are receiving the country by country reports as of now. And this is after 6 or 7 years of the standard being launched. So we really see that practically these are not really affecting the developing countries whom they are meant for. And as you asked, can it be fixed? Can the OECD be fixed? I mean, again, Article 1 and Article 6 of the OECD Convention provide red lines as to how much the organization can change. Can voting happen? Probably not. And that's a very fundamental question, because even, let's say, everybody speaks and gives, excellent proposals to solutions like ATAP did. They had this idea of how to tax a portion of total profit instead of only residual profit. How is it chosen which proposal is selected? Because every proposal cannot become a solution. And as long as you have a consensus-based system in complete secrecy and opacity, the role of big power politics will come in, so numbers will become sort of irrelevant. So, so that puts limits, as what Nara said, to how much capacity building can achieve. Let's say you reach that outcome and everybody provides. But this is also very far from the reality. As Nara was saying, you get these proposals one night before. You look at the recent proposals on tax certainty. 2 documents, one 87 pages, the other 67 pages, and 2 weeks to respond. I mean, it's extremely unlikely to think that countries with tiny tax administrations can, go through it and respond. And again, even if they respond, how will it be chosen? The decision-making process is really fundamental. So I think there are real limits to what the OECD can deliver. And that's why in the long run, we have to look beyond the OECD.
Yeah, agreed. I have to say, Tax Justice Network has more or less stopped responding to those consultations because, you know, even for us, a body of people who are sort of dedicated to working on that stuff, it just doesn't seem either worth it or reasonable to respond within the timelines that are being set. But Abdul, I wanted to push you on one point. So in your I don't want to talk too much about the UN Convention ideas because that's our event on the 28th of June, did I mention? But you know, your proposal with Sol Picciotto is obviously a kind of really important one. Within that, one of the elements that's interesting, and I know made one or two people raise an eyebrow, was the idea of sort of bringing the inclusive framework somehow into the process. And I think perhaps people thought, does that mean bringing the OECD in, or trying to fix something that's difficult to fix? Would it not be better to start again? Just, I'd be interested to kind of understand what exactly that intended and what the thought was.
Yeah, so to just give a bit of backdrop, what the G77 has been asking for decades is to upgrade the UN Tax Committee into an intergovernmental body. And this hasn't happened. And one of the reasons why it hasn't happened is it's sort of like a zero sum again, because it would mean that the OECD's institutions would become out of business, so to speak. It would only be the UN. So this meant that the developed countries gave their full energy to preventing this from happening, and this will continue to be in the future. The Framework Convention idea kind of tries to get around this by saying that let the existing institutions remain, do their work, carry on, because they have to some extent overlapping but not completely overlapping mandates, but at least let them answer to everybody, because right now the inclusive framework answers only to the G20 and OECD countries. So this way, the question which will change is not which body is there, so to speak, but rather who the existing institutions are reporting to, are accountable to. Now, whether this would bring the OECD in, it depends. Would it bring OECD member states in? Of course it would, because the idea is to have universal participation. Would it bring the OECD Secretariat in? It would not, and it should not. The Secretariat, as Nara and Marilu had mentioned, should be kept completely neutral and should have a composition which has nothing to do with the existing Secretariat, because the Secretariat is very, very influential, not just because it is the source of the proposals which are then discussed, but also because sometimes it can affect the negotiations. I mean, the unified proposal was a way to break the logjam between the three competing proposals. Have we heard of situations in other international organizations where the Secretariat is breaking the logjam in negotiations? I mean, it's quite unlikely. So that way, it depends on what we mean by the OECD. And if we distinguish the Secretariat and the members, then to summarize, the members should be included, but the Secretariat should be kept out.
Thanks, Abdul. You remind me of one of the most shocking elements for me, I thought, of that process, which was when the unified proposal was introduced as if it somehow had anything to do with the proposals that had been under consideration, rather than being the result of bilateral US-French negotiations, which then changed, meaning that the unified proposal had to change, and everyone was sort of expected to nod along and say, oh yes, that's what we're negotiating, yes, that's fine. But look, thank you, it's kind of very clear. So Nara, if I can come to you, whether, to go back to my original question, whether you think that characterization is broadly fair, and if it is, whether, what the options really are for countries who are not OECD members to look for roads to progress in future.
I will definitely agree with Marilu and Abdul that this is actually is a fair characterization because it's factual, it's evidence-based. Into what can be done to improve the process. And again, like I was saying earlier, the big problem is that silence is consent, basically, in the existing setting. And I would actually concur with what Abdul presented, and also a bit what Marilu has said. So maybe a solution in this sense will be, we can't throw the baby with the water, right? I mean, there's been a process that exists with its flaws, definitely, but that has done some work, and that has tried to bring many countries into an international tax governance process of multilateralism. So we must acknowledge that. But again, it's about how do we fix it. And based on what Abdul was saying in terms of the limitation of the existing framework and the inclusive framework, the idea of having an independent secretariat that responds to institutions beyond the G20 is, for me, is actually a way to go. Bring an independent secretariat and allowing more representative institutions, the African Union, the UN tax committees and other institutions to which the independent tax secretariat will be accountable to will be a way to go. And at the regional level, I will add that a process below that will be to ensure that regional consultative process continue to happen, because that's, I mean, the Thibault idea of being closer to the people. You bring the regional consultation closer to the people and make sure that at least at that level, the pace is reasonable, the voices are heard, the concerns are on the table, and then the solutions are built up, not in a one-size-fits-all, but in a way that represents the ideas of a majority. And then find a way then to bring those regional consultation decisions at that international forum, where again things will be presented in a bit more. I mean, we will not have that silence is consent things happening, because again, we live in the real world. Is the survival of the strongest in this case, survival of the richest, or survival of the most powerful. That will always happen. So we have to find a way to circumvent that by these kind of options.
Thank you. So I want to turn it round a bit, and then I am going to go to the Q&A questions people have been adding. So thank you for them, and do keep adding them. But I want to ask all of you again to think about this from the other side. If we look at OECD member countries, on the one hand, we can say that in aggregate, OECD members and their dependent territories are responsible for the vast majority of cross-border tax abuse, both corporate and individual. But that's really led by and dominated by a fairly small number of countries and jurisdictions, including my own in the UK. So for most OECD member countries, the position is something like this, that they lose the largest amount of tax revenues in absolute terms, not proportionally, but in absolute terms. And that undermines their revenues, just as it does everyone else's. And it undermines the progressiveness of their tax systems, just as it does for everyone else, because it makes it harder to tax income and wealth and profits and capital gains. Now, in theory, these countries together have the power. And yet, even where they seem set on making things better, it feels like they always get outmaneuvered. So there's a couple of options there. Is it because it's this opaque and very highly lobbied context in the OECD, and actually the multinationals and their advisors and the number of jurisdictions that are still winning from this are able to outmaneuver them? Or is it that the countries that could be champions within the OECD just don't care enough? And perhaps don't have enough pressure from their publics, or their publics, it's not kind of visible what's happening at the OECD to make it move. So I guess the question I'm not making very clearly is, thinking about the role of progressive OECD members, if we assume that there are some, and I think that's not unfair, what could they be doing at this stage? From their point of view, should they be saying, we can fix the OECD, we can make this work better for us at least, even if it doesn't work for anyone else, or ideally they'd say, let's try and make it work better for everyone? Or even from their point of view, is it perhaps more reasonable to think that they should get behind some more dramatic reform? Let me stick to the same order. So Mary Lou, can I put that to you?
Thank you. Yeah, I've heard this argument that the larger countries have more to lose in absolute amounts, and so therefore their interests take precedence. But tax revenues are what are rightfully owed to countries, whatever that amount. And so so a system, that allows countries to collect their rightful share of the revenue seems to me a proper system, whether you're big or small. And more importantly, for the smaller countries, it's actually disproportionate because their tax base is smaller and they rely more on corporate tax revenues. Whether they should or not, I don't know, but that's the fact. Now, on the political economy of progressive, let's say, can this be more progressive from the perspective of some OECD members? I have always wondered about that, whether a system that allows countries to collect a larger share of what they're owed would actually mean a loss for on revenues of the others. From what I gathered, there could have been a solution that could have addressed tax competition a bit more squarely, and then most will actually gain, well, if not, except for a few. So it's not that a pie could be bigger and allow others to go. So these are mysterious outcomes that that kind of hard to understand from a policymaker's point of view. But then if you put in place the political economy of things, the power of corporations in the large industrial countries, perhaps one could explain this a bit more, but that would probably require a look back, an extensive look at the political economy of tax reforms in large countries that then influence their political views in global forums. So thank you.
Thank you. That's actually a good point. I'm not aware of a great many studies of, in a sense, the successes that there have been within OECD countries in terms of significant progressive tax reforms at a purely domestic level, and when they've managed to overcome the internal resistance. Perhaps that's one place that we should start looking to think about what could tip those countries into playing a more useful role internationally. Abdul, let me come to you. I wonder if perhaps you think that that there either aren't any progressive OECD countries, or we just shouldn't be relying on them and should be trying to find a way forward that that they're welcome to come with, but not to expect much from them. Or might there be, might it be useful to think through what they could gain from kind of making changes in this way?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I'll just begin with a little anecdote. I was talking to someone from the Portuguese Ministry of Finance, and he said that the only thing we didn't like was that the minimum rate wasn't too high, but it was not a big deal. And then he said, I wonder why these developing countries agree to this deal. It's clearly not in their interest. And there was this discussion with him about, do you think the people of Portugal will protest for a better deal? He said, why should they? We are the ones benefiting. And that really gives you the essence of the story. Portugal is one of the poorer European countries, but it's a capital exporting country like most of the other European countries. And this is basically a deal where it's capital exporting versus capital importing countries. And that is borne out by the evidence. No European or other developed countries have protested Pillar 1. The only protests that have come have been on Pillar 2, where countries like Poland and Hungary have been unhappy with the restrictions on their ability to provide tax incentives and so on. But when it really comes to the redistribution of taxing rights, which is what Pillar 1 is about, there has been no evidence of these countries actually saying or doing anything. So if we go with the evidence base, there doesn't seem to be much data to support this theory that there are that many progressive OECD countries which will support the reallocation of taxing rights, which makes sense because they're capital exporters. Now, that being said, as Mary Lou was pointing out, governance reforms are needed in the OECD, and if these countries can get behind it, then that is something which definitely should be found out. And these kinds of dissatisfactions, such as with Hungary, Poland, and so on, can definitely provide one basis to find which are these countries who will, for their own interests, not for any altruism or anything, be interested in pushing forward reforms to the inclusive framework.
Thanks, Abdul. Portugal is an interesting case. When the pandemic broke, and it was particularly bad in Southern Europe in the early stages, the Dutch government came out and said that the EU shouldn't support those countries, even though their health systems were in desperate situations, because they were fiscally irresponsible. you know, it's the most kind of take up of tax justice work there's ever been in Portugal was based on our response to that, showing that, you know, if there's fiscal irresponsibility in terms of taxation within Europe, it's the way that the Netherlands strips so much revenue from other countries, especially in Southern Europe. And you know, the Portuguese public anger about that is part of what contributed with others to the kind of turnaround in the Dutch position, and Dutch political parties wanting to say, we are not going to be a tax haven anymore, but recognizing that they have been one. So I think there is something there, but maybe it's difficult to turn that dynamic out of the EU and into the global space. Perhaps that's something for us in the movement to think about.
I'll just add one quick point. I'm sorry. If the option is a better inclusive framework versus worse inclusive framework, we can count on these countries to focus on reforms. But if the choice is between inclusive framework versus a global body, then it's much easier for these countries to have their way within the inclusive framework because it's ultimately part of the OECD. So then these are again the limits of what to expect from the so-called progressive countries. Yeah.
Okay. So Nara, you know, you've been quite closely involved in elements of these negotiations, and I guess you've seen the positions that different OECD members have taken and where they've disagreed with each other and so on. Do you have a kind of an insight into how it might be possible, or if it would be possible, to empower or identify a path for progressive OECD countries to make a better global contribution? Or am I kidding myself?
It's actually interesting because asking for taxation is a purely sovereign matter, and for me, when listening to, hearing your question is almost like we're literally asking these countries to be altruistic and think about others beyond their own tax sovereignty and what they may gain from the rules for themselves. And is that a fair ask? Yeah, definitely. In the globalized world, like Adam Smith said, that maybe sometime, I don't know, maybe it's counterproductive, because if you focus on your self-interest, then it will result in the gain for everybody. But in this case, with this globalized world, and we've seen the effect of the global pandemic, it might not actually work. So I'm actually posing more questions than I'm actually answering. That is it fair to expect that from them, or find concrete ways and rules and procedures to actually effect the changes? And related to the first assertion that the larger countries tend to lose a bit more in terms of in absolute term. Maybe we need a bit more evidence there, because it's almost like when we consider at least the digitalized, the profit allocation from digitalized companies like Facebook and Google, is almost like, is it a zero-sum game there, where if you pull the blanket more towards one, then other countries will have less? So we need a bit more evidence to actually back that up, I believe. So that's what I would say. Sorry, I have more questions than answer there.
No, we're all here for the questions. I suppose I don't think I'm hoping for altruism, although, you know, the history of imperial violence and plunder would suggest that there's any amount of reasons why European countries ought to be more altruistic. But I guess I'm thinking there is space for common cause, because so many EU members, say, lose so much to their own EU neighbours, and you could fix the rules in a way that would work for you and for everyone else who is suffering this in a more extreme way. But maybe that's just a case we haven't made clearly enough as a movement. Let me go to I realise I'm letting time run on because this is kind of fascinating, but I want to get into some of the audience's Q&A. So there was a particular question. Hang on, sorry. Right. So yeah, one question, and this came up yesterday at the EU Tax Observatory discussions, which was basically, if the US doesn't pass any of this, then does that scupper everything? And when I say scupper, I mean in a sense, end the arm twisting that might force lots of countries to do things that aren't very good for them. Is it that simple? If the US doesn't put this through, does it let everyone else off the hook, and then we can focus on better outcomes? Or are there still threats in the scenario? In a sense, could it be worse if the US doesn't put it through? Do we lose the kind of the wins that we've had in terms of normalizing the idea that some unitary taxation at least might be okay, and that ending the race to the bottom could be a good thing? Or can we sort of lose the US because of their political issues, keep hold of those ideas, and then push on to sort of deliver them in a better way? Shall we do this in reverse? So shall I ask you first, Nara, rather than coming to you last each time?
I'm not sure if I understand the question correctly. If you don't, I mean, what I will say is that we've seen, remember when the US implemented the FATCA agreement, I mean, the world followed there. I mean, it was their way or the highway. And you saw that at the end, it was their way that basically prevailed. Again, in this sense, again, sorry, I might not have grasped your question well, but I just will say that definitely the impact here will definitely play a big role in either continuing or basically presenting it as a hurdle for the whole process. Yeah. That's what I would say to contribute.
No, thank you. So Abdul, I mean, you said already, if the US doesn't ratify, then nobody else should sign. I mean, without that would be your position on that?
I would build on that, saying that developing countries should wait till all of these countries, which includes UK, Japan, etc., ratify the agreement, not just the US, because the fewer countries ratify, the less there is to redistribute. So normatively, that is the recommendation. The US is very unlikely to ratify because, again, this is a country which refuses to exchange tax information. So giving up the tax base is even more unlikely. But, what is most likely to happen is the ideal situation for developed countries is where they don't give up any of their taxing rights and they force the developing countries to give up all their taxing rights. So the most probable scenario is that the US doesn't ratify, in even the OECD, other OECD countries may not ratify, but they will force the developing countries to ratify. This is something which is highly possible, a high probability threat which developing countries should prepare for. So it's not that, they will first ratify and then they will tell the others to sign up. Both of these are going to happen. We are almost at the end of the event. So I'm just going to answer two questions which have come in the chat. One very, very interesting. One is by Bob Michel. To summarize his question, he asks that since amount covers all kinds of income, how will this affect taxation going forward? And this is really a very, very big question, because in the future, tax treaties might be fundamentally undermined by saying that just go to amount A, don't have Article 12A on technical service fees, and don't have international shipping and whatnot. So this is a very good point which Bob Michel has raised, and which developing countries should be even more concerned about. And the second question, which I'd like to respond to, is anything preventing a group of like-minded countries from having their own corporate tax treaty? To this, I would say that there are basically two reasons why it is unlikely and even unadvisable. The first one is because this is something, if you're going to go with a multilateral approach, then it's best to have all countries involved, because these companies are operating in 50, 60, 100 countries. So handling issues like where is the revenue sourced from, how will double taxation be figured out, is something which really requires the whole world on board. If you just have, it's unlikely that companies will just be in one continent or so on. And the second reason is that till today, we have never had a multilateral treaty allocating taxing rights. But the OECD is the first step in that direction. So again, it's something which is very, very, very technically complex. Let's wait and watch how the OECD experiment turns out before we then think about regional initiatives. But on that note, I would just like to flag African Tax Administration Forum has provided guidance on what individual countries can do. ATAF has a suggested draft legislation on digital service taxes. So initiatives like those can definitely be undertaken where model rules are made drawing upon regional experience for the countries of that region.
Thanks, Abdul. And you're doing a better job with the time than I am. So Mary Lou, let me ask you the question of, you know, how you think a US rejection might then impact on others, and perhaps whether you think it's likely, but also if you want to pick up any other questions and perhaps any closing thoughts.
Thank you. I don't have much to add to what Abdul and Nara said in terms of the dynamics going forward. But as I said earlier on, that really imperative to developing countries is to find a way to do better in terms of taxation at source. And if the ratification drags out, as Abdul says, one wants to wait to see what others actually do. But for countries themselves, they could, particularly the ones with treaties, could take a look at what they can do, the flexibilities within their treaties, you know, in order to improve their taxation at source. And as they said, I remember in one of your earlier webinars that what this process has done is to release the genie from the bottle. And so the prospects of actually sharing profits with market countries and profit allocation. So the idea is there, and the task ahead, if there is no multilateral solution in the OECD, that countries can then explore possibilities to make that happen within their own jurisdictions with, let's say, more sympathetic treaty partners. Now, lastly, and not much has been said on the global minimum tax, and I mentioned this earlier, that here it's voluntary, and countries, the experience has shown that countries have actually benefited from putting in place corporate tax floors, even with capacities that are wanting. So there's a lot of scope for countries to actually take a look at their own domestic regimes and find a way to capitalize or to take advantage of the benefits of a domestic minimum corporate tax. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Lou. Let me just offer a last word to Nara, and then I'll wrap up. Nara, because I didn't give you that opportunity, sorry.
Nothing much to add, but I'm just saying that it's been a very interesting debate, and looking forward to see how each and every one of us in respective institution can continue to actually encourage, push forward this debate, especially finding hopefully the right place for this debate to take place, whether continuing in an improved system within the inclusive framework, or shifting radically or drastically towards another system, and including, for example, the United Nations Tax Committee.
Well, look, thank you, Nara Monkham, Abdul Chowdhury, and Mary Lou Wee. It's been a really fascinating discussion, and I'm very grateful to you all. I'm kind of left with the thought, recognizing that we're over time, that, you know, there is a lot to do within the current position. The OECD isn't going away, and these proposals aren't going away, even if we're increasingly clear about the little likelihood of there being benefits for a great many countries. So we can't afford to look away from this. But at the same time, we need to raise our eyes to the horizon too, and think about options, including the UN Tax Convention, and how we shift potentially quite radically the governance around through which these sorts of decisions are made, if we're to have any hope of unwinding the gross global inequalities in taxing rights. Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, to an extent, show us the way. They establish the reasonableness of unitary taxation over the arm's length principle, and of ending the race to the bottom through effective minimum tax rates. But they deliver on neither. And what they do deliver is delivered in an extremely unfair way in terms of the distribution of any benefits. The risk of countries that will benefit least having their arms twisted to be forced to sign up remains great, and on the basis of effectively signing a blank check, because they don't have the information from the OECD or anywhere else to have any confidence in what the actual impact of signing up will be. So we need to be working on that, but also looking ahead to our event in 2 weeks' time on the promise of a UN tax convention, in which we hope to explore both the potential for improvements on the transparency side and genuinely inclusive higher international standards, and the creation of an intergovernmental tax body, as we've talked about today. So the last thing I have to do is to flag one further event in our series. So the UN Tax Convention event is the last one in this series, sorry, on the 28th of June. There's a separate event on the 12th of July on the subject of the UK's role in tax as a tool for racial justice. And this is, well, we'll be presenting work, or rather the wonderful people of Decolonising Economics will be presenting work that they've done with our sister organisation Tax Justice UK, looking at the way that the UK's tax system and other actions impact both historically and now on questions of racial justice. Something which I think may also get a mention in our discussion of the UN Tax Convention in 2 weeks' time. So I hope very much to see you all there. Thank you for joining us. My apologies again for the fire alarm going off here. I don't know what to say about that other than don't work in random offices in the City of London, which is probably a moral for all of us. So with that, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good day, and goodbye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.